You're sitting in a dark theater, and suddenly the most haunting, beautiful melody you've ever heard fills the air. The music doesn't just play. It grabs you by the soul and refuses to let go. That's the power of Richard Wagner, a man whose music could make emperors weep and whose personal life was more dramatic than any soap opera you've ever watched. But here's the twist. This musical genius was also one of history's most controversial figures. By the time we're done today, you'll understand why his name still sparks heated debates more than 140 years after his death. Wilhelm Richard Wagner entered this world on May 22, 1813 in Leipzig, a city that would soon become the center of one of Europe's bloodiest battles. His father, Karl, was a police officer, and his mother, Johanna, had already given birth to 8 other children. Richard was the baby of a very crowded household. Now here's where things get interesting. Some historians believe Karl wasn't actually Richard's biological father. They point to Ludwig Geyer, a painter and actor who was suspiciously close to the Wagner family. The evidence? Richard wasn't baptized right after birth like every other child in that era. Instead, his mother made a dangerous journey through war-torn Europe to visit Geyer, and only then was Richard baptized, 3 months late. Whether this theory holds water or not, one thing was certain. Richard was born into chaos. Europe was tearing itself apart in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had just suffered his catastrophic defeat in Russia, and by the summer Richard was born, enemy armies were marching toward Leipzig. In October, over 500,000 soldiers would clash in the largest battle Europe had ever seen. Tragedy struck the Wagner household early. Karl died of typhoid fever in November 1813 when Richard was barely 6 months old. Enter Ludwig Geyer, who swooped in to rescue Johanna and her 9 children. They married the following year and moved to Dresden, where Richard would spend his formative years going by the name Richard Geyer. Geyer became the father figure Richard never really had. The man was theater-obsessed, and this passion rubbed off on young Richard immediately. But fate wasn't done testing the family. Geyer died when Richard was just 8 years old. The boy was shuffled around between relatives before eventually landing at the Kreuzschule in Dresden, a school that had been training choir boys since the 1300s. Music was everywhere in the Wagner household. His older sisters were already opera singers, and Richard caught the bug early. But here's what made him different. While everyone else was obsessing over Italian opera, Richard was drawn to German folk music. He fell in love with works like Carl Maria von Weber's Der Freischütz, which told distinctly German stories with German melodies. Richard wasn't just passionate about music, though. He devoured literature, especially Homer's epic poems and Shakespeare's plays. By age 14, he was so inspired that he decided to write his own tragedy called Lubald und Adelaide. The kid was basically trying to be the next Shakespeare, and Beethoven rolled into one. When he turned 14, something symbolic happened. He dropped the name Geyer and became Richard Wagner again. He moved back to Leipzig and enrolled at the Nikolai Schule, but school wasn't really his thing. He wanted to create, not study. Against his family's wishes, he started taking music lessons from Christian Müller, a violinist at the famous Leipzig Gewandhaus. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1829, 16-year-old Richard watched soprano Wilhelmina Schröder-Devrient perform in Beethoven's Fidelio. He was absolutely mesmerized by her dramatic interpretation. He immediately wrote her a letter declaring his intention to compose music worthy of her talents. Later, he would reflect that no other event in his entire life made such a profound impression on him. This is when Wagner's rebellious streak really started showing. In 1830, he wrote an overture inspired by Beethoven, but being Wagner, he couldn't just copy the master. He decided to interrupt the main theme with a thunderous drum beat every 5th bar. When it premiered, the audience was initially confused. then started laughing because they could anticipate when that booming drum would hit. It was Wagner's first taste of shocking an audience, something he'd become famous for. University life at Leipzig introduced Wagner to more than just advanced music theory. He joined the Saxonia Club, a student fraternity that supported German unification and liberal ideas. But Wagner also discovered drinking, gambling, and partying. He developed such a serious gambling addiction that he lost almost everything he owned. Fortunately, a streak of lucky wins helped him recover his losses, and this close call scared him enough to quit gambling for good. His real musical education began in August 1831 when he started studying composition with Theodor Weinlig at St. Thomas Church. Weinlig was impressed by Wagner's natural talent and helped him compose his first published work, a piano sonata in B-flat major. By 1832, Wagner had impressed audiences at the Gewandhaus with his compositions, and Weinlig told his mother that he had taught Richard everything he could. Success in Leipzig wasn't enough for Wagner. He wanted to see the world where his musical heroes had lived and worked. After spending time in Vienna, he traveled to Bohemia, where he met Jenny and August Rehmann, daughters of a count whom he'd admired since 1827. It seems Richard had romantic intentions toward Jenny, but reality hit hard when he realized that an aristocratic woman would never marry someone of his humble background. This heartbreak became creative fuel. Wagner channeled his disappointment into writing his first original opera, Die Hochzeit, or The Wedding. Unlike other composers who worked with separate librettists, Wagner wrote both the words and music himself, a practice that would become his trademark. The story, inspired by his own romantic rejection in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, featured feuding families, forbidden love, and tragic death. However, when his sister Rosalie criticized the dark subject matter, Wagner abandoned the project. This pattern of starting ambitious projects and then abandoning them would repeat throughout his career, but it was all part of his creative process. In 1833, Wagner landed his first professional job as choir master at a theater in Würzburg. During his year there, he completed his first full opera, Die Feen, or The Fairies. When he returned to Leipzig in 1834, he struggled to get it performed, but he was already sketching his next project, Das Liebesverbot, or The Ban on Love, inspired by Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. Wagner's personal life took another dramatic turn when he moved to Bad Lauchstädt to work with the struggling Magdeburg Theater Company. On his very first day, he spotted Christine Wilhelmina Planner, nicknamed Mina, a beautiful actress 4 years older than him. It was love at first sight, at least for Wagner. After a passionate courtship filled with drama and uncertainty, they became engaged in February 1835. But Wagner's professional life was a mess. The theater company was broke, the performers were barely paid, and Wagner himself was drowning in debt. When Das Liebesverbot finally premiered in March 1836, it was a complete disaster. The lead singer forgot the words, the audience was unimpressed, and after just one performance, the show was cancelled. The company fell apart, and Minna left for Königsberg to find work. Wagner followed Minna to Königsberg, where they married in November 1836. But marriage didn't solve their problems. It made them worse. They argued constantly, and just months after their wedding, Minna ran off with a businessman named Dietrich. Wagner, meanwhile, had secured a position as music director at a theater in Riga. The separation didn't last long. Minna sent Wagner an apologetic letter, and they reunited in Riga. It was here that Wagner began working on what would become one of his most ambitious early works. Rienzi, based on the life of a 14th-century Italian revolutionary who briefly ruled Rome before being overthrown. When Wagner's contract in Riga ended in 1839, he and Minna faced a serious problem. His creditors wanted their money. The couple made a daring escape across the border and began a nomadic period that took them to London and Paris. In Paris, Wagner rubbed shoulders with literary giants like Heinrich Heine and composers like Giacomo Meyerbeer and Hector Berlioz. Inspired by this creative environment, Wagner wrote his first movement of a symphony based on Goethe's Faust. Though he later converted it to an overture, it remains one of his most popular instrumental pieces. But making a living was still a struggle. Wagner desperately tried to get his earlier opera Das Liebesverbot staged in Paris, convinced it had just found the wrong audience in Germany. When that didn't work out, Wagner scaled back his ambitions and proposed a new one-act opera, Der Fliegende Holländer, or The Flying Dutchman, based on one of Heine's stories. To pay the bills, he also tried his hand at music criticism, writing articles about the German musical scene. The work brought him recognition but very little money. Wagner narrowly avoided debtor's prison, but his fortunes began to change when he completed Rienzi in November 1840 and received permission to stage it in Dresden. This encouraged him to finish The Flying Dutchman, and by November 1841 he had completed both the libretto and the music. When Wagner returned to Germany in 1842, he was a different man than the struggling artist who had left. Rienzi premiered at the Dresden Court Theatre on October 20, 1842, and Wagner conducted from the podium, watching in amazement as the audience remained riveted through the entire 6-hour performance. After years of struggle, he finally had validation. The Flying Dutchman followed in January 1843, and Wagner made some significant changes to the story. Instead of setting it off the Scottish coast as Heine had done, Wagner moved the action to Norway, drawing on his own experiences crossing the North Sea. The story of a ghostly Dutch captain cursed to sail the seas forever, seeking a woman whose love could break his curse, resonated with audiences in ways that his earlier works hadn't. Wagner's star was rising. In February 1843, he was appointed Royal Kapellmeister at the Saxon court, the first financially secure position of his life. Around this time, he also met Karl August Rückel, a socialist musician who introduced him to radical political ideas that would shape his worldview for years to come. Now comfortably employed, Wagner turned his attention to Tannhäuser, based on a medieval German poet. The opera explored the conflict between sacred and profane love, with the title character torn between the pagan goddess Venus and the pure Princess Elizabeth. It was Wagner's most psychologically complex work to date, dealing with themes of redemption and the struggle between spiritual and earthly desires. But Wagner wasn't content to just write operas. The political upheavals of 1848 swept across Europe, and Wagner found himself caught up in revolutionary fervor. He contributed articles to radical publications and even wrote a sketch for a drama about Jesus as a social revolutionary. When revolution broke out in Dresden in May 1849, Wagner actively supported the rebels, distributing propaganda and helping with logistics. The revolution failed, and Wagner had to flee Germany to avoid arrest. He settled in Zurich, Switzerland, where he began developing his theories about art and music. Influenced by socialist writers and philosophers, Wagner denounced both Christianity and industrialization as constraints on human creativity. During his exile, Wagner began conceptualizing his most ambitious project yet. He had identified the dramatic potential of the Nibelungenlied, a 13th-century German epic poem. What started as one opera about Siegfried's death expanded into something unprecedented, a 4-part epic that would take 4 evenings to perform, telling the complete story of the Nibelungsring and the Twilight of the Gods. Wagner called this massive project the Ring of the Nibelung, though we know it today as the Ring Cycle. He spent years writing the librettos for all 4 operas, Das Rheingold, Die Walküre, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung. This wasn't just music. It was Wagner's attempt to create a new form of art that combined drama, music, poetry, and stagecraft into one unified experience. While working on The Ring, Wagner's personal life became increasingly complicated. He had become close friends with Otto Wesendonck, a wealthy silk merchant, and his young wife Matilda. Wagner was clearly infatuated with Matilda, dedicating compositions to her and spending hours in her company. The relationship inspired some of his most beautiful music, including the Wesendonck Lieder and his opera Tristan und Isolde. Wagner's marriage to Minna was falling apart. She was suspicious of his relationship with Matilda, and when she intercepted a letter from Wagner to Matilda, everything exploded. Both couples were forced to confront the situation directly. Wagner eventually decided he had to distance himself from the Wesendoncks, which meant leaving Zurich and separating from Minna. Enter Cosima von Bülow, daughter of the famous composer Franz Liszt and wife of conductor Hans von Bülow. Wagner had met the couple years earlier, but now Cosima confided that she was unhappy in her marriage. When Wagner left Zurich in 1858, it was clear that his future lay with Cosima, not Minna. Wagner spent the next several years wandering Europe, working on his compositions and trying to get them performed. Tristan und Isolde, inspired by his relationship with Matilda Wesendonck, proved too challenging for most orchestras of the time. The harmonies were so revolutionary that musicians couldn't wrap their heads around them. Everything changed in 1864 when Wagner received an unexpected summons from King Ludwig II of Bavaria. The 18-year-old king was a passionate Wagner admirer who had just inherited the throne. He promised to rescue Wagner from his financial troubles and support his artistic vision. Within hours of receiving the invitation, Wagner was on a train to Munich. King Ludwig was as good as his word. He paid off Wagner's massive debts and provided him with a generous salary. More importantly, he promised to support Wagner's dream of building a special theater where the Ring cycle could be performed as the composer intended. With royal backing secured, Wagner could finally focus on his personal happiness. Cosima arrived at Lake Starnberg in June 1865, ostensibly to visit, but she and Wagner began an affair almost immediately. When her husband Hans arrived a week later, he suspected nothing. In October 1865, Wagner moved to Munich to prepare for the premiere of Tristan und Isolde. The opera finally premiered on June 10, 1865, with Cosima secretly giving birth to Wagner's daughter Isolde on the very day rehearsals began. The performance was revolutionary. Wagner opened with what became known as the Tristan chord, a dissonant harmony that created tension throughout the entire 4-hour opera, only resolving at the very end with Isolde's death. But Wagner's relationship with King Ludwig's government was deteriorating. The ministers resented his influence over the young king and the enormous sums being spent on his projects. In December 1865, Ludwig reluctantly asked Wagner to leave Munich, though he continued his financial support. Wagner and Cosima moved to a house called Tribschen on Lake Lucerne, where they lived openly as a couple despite both still being married to other people. It was here that Wagner completed Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, a surprisingly light-hearted opera about medieval German craftsmen and their singing competitions. The opera, which premiered in Munich in 1868, was conducted by Hans von Bülow. Yes, Cosima's husband, who was conducting the premiere of an opera written by the man having an affair with his wife. This bizarre situation says everything you need to know about the complicated relationships in Wagner's circle. By this time, Wagner and Cosima had 2 children together, and in 1870, after legal proceedings, Cosima's marriage to Hans was finally dissolved. Wagner and Cosima married on August 25, 1870, just as the Franco-Prussian War was creating the German Empire that Wagner had dreamed of since his revolutionary days. With Germany finally unified, Wagner began looking for a place to realize his ultimate dream. A festival theater where the Ring Cycle could be performed exactly as he envisioned. They chose Bayreuth, a small town in northern Bavaria, and in 1872 Wagner laid the foundation stone for his theater. Funding the project required Wagner to tour Europe giving concerts. Even with King Ludwig's eventual financial assistance, money was always tight. But Wagner persevered, and on April 28, 1874, he and Cosima moved into their new home, Wanfried, where Wagner finally completed Götterdämmerung in November, more than 25 years after he first conceived the Ring Cycle. The inaugural Bayreuth Festival opened on August 13, 1876, with Wagner's complete Ring Cycle. The event was attended by emperors, kings, and the greatest composers of the age, including Tchaikovsky, Bruckner, and Liszt. Even Friedrich Nietzsche, who had become one of Wagner's closest friends, was there to witness history being made. The Ring Cycle tells an epic story of gods, heroes, and the corruption of power. It begins with Das Rheingold, where the dwarf Alberic steals gold from the Rhine maidens and forges a ring that grants ultimate power. The story follows the curse of this ring through generations, ending with Götterdämmerung, where the gods themselves are destroyed and the world is cleansed by fire and flood. While the 1876 festival was an artistic triumph, it was a financial disaster. Wagner lost $150,000 and had to close after just 3 complete cycles. The experience left him exhausted and disillusioned, and he would never see the Ring performed at Bayreuth again in his lifetime. Wagner's final opera was Parsifal, based on the Arthurian legend of the Holy Grail. Unlike his earlier works, this opera was deeply influenced by both Christian symbolism and Buddhist philosophy, emphasizing purity and the release from suffering through death. The work marked a complete transformation from the revolutionary who had manned the barricades in 1849 to the aging artist seeking spiritual meaning. Parsifal premiered at Bayreuth on July 26, 1882. In a touching final gesture during the last performance, Wagner crept into the orchestra pit during the third act, took the baton from conductor Hermann Levy, and conducted the conclusion of his final masterpiece himself. Not long after this emotional farewell to his life's work, Wagner and Cosima traveled to Venice for the winter. Wagner's health had been declining for years, and on February 13, 1883, he suffered a heart attack and died at age 69. His body was transported back to Bayreuth, where he was buried in the garden of Wanfried. So what's Wagner's legacy? Musically, he revolutionized opera and laid the groundwork for modern film scoring. His influence on harmony and orchestration cannot be overstated. Every time you hear a movie soundtrack that swells with emotion and drives the dramatic action, you're hearing Wagner's influence. But there's no escaping the controversy. Wagner's political views evolved from youthful revolutionary idealism to increasingly conservative nationalism. Most problematically, his anti-Semitic writings became more virulent over time, despite maintaining friendships with many Jewish musicians and intellectuals. He viewed Jewish people with suspicion and advocated for their exclusion from German cultural life. These views would later be appropriated by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, who used Wagner's music and mythology to promote their ideology. Hitler saw himself as a modern Parsifal, purifying Germany and creating a new order. This association has cast a shadow over Wagner's legacy that persists to this day. Here's the difficult question we have to grapple with. Can we separate the artist from their art? Wagner's music is undeniably powerful and beautiful. His innovations in harmony, orchestration, and musical drama influenced every composer who came after him. The Ring Cycle remains one of the greatest artistic achievements in human history. But we can't ignore his personal flaws and controversial political views. Wagner was a product of his time when anti-Semitism was unfortunately common across Europe, but that doesn't excuse his writings or their later misuse. Perhaps the answer lies in understanding Wagner as a complex, flawed human being whose artistic genius coexisted with troubling personal beliefs. We can appreciate his musical innovations while rejecting his prejudices. We can be moved by Isolde's love duet while condemning his anti-Semitic essays. The Bayreuth Festival continues today more than 140 years after Wagner founded it. Every summer, music lovers from around the world gather to experience his operas as he intended them to be performed. The festival has evolved to acknowledge Wagner's problematic legacy while celebrating his undeniable artistic achievements. Wagner's story reminds us that great art often comes from deeply flawed people. His music expresses the full range of human emotion: love, hate, redemption, destruction, hope, and despair. Maybe that's why it remains so powerful after all these years. It doesn't offer easy answers or moral clarity. Instead, it forces us to confront the complexity of human nature in all its beauty and ugliness. What do you think? Is it possible to love Wagner's music while rejecting his personal prejudices? Can we appreciate artistic genius while acknowledging moral failure? These aren't easy questions, and reasonable people can disagree, but one thing is certain. Whether you love him or hate him, Richard Wagner changed music forever. His influence echoes through every movie theater and concert hall in the world. And 140 years after his death, we're still talking about him, still debating his legacy, still being moved by his music. That, perhaps, is the mark of true artistic immortality, creating work so powerful that it forces each generation to grapple with fundamental questions about art, morality, and human nature. Wagner may have been controversial, but he was never boring. If you found this exploration of Wagner's complex legacy interesting, let me know in the comments what other controversial historical figures you'd like to see covered. And if you enjoyed diving deep into the intersection of art and politics, make sure to subscribe for more content that tackles the complicated questions about history's most fascinating personalities.